This study was recently accepted for publication in the Journal of Physical Activity and Health and was co-first authored by myself and Dr. Patrick McPhee. I would also like to acknowledge the collaborative efforts and contributions of Drs. Matt Kwan and Kwan Timmons. In the past 5 years, there's been a shift away from investigating the physical activity, sedentary, and sleep behaviors of children in isolation to an integrated approach that takes into account all movement behaviors across an entire 24-hour period. This approach emphasizes that the whole day matters for healthy development. While the 24-hour movement guidelines for children and youth may be appropriate for typically developing children, their development did not include children with chronic medical conditions or disabilities, and thus their applicability to these populations is largely unknown. More recently, however, the World Health Organization updated their guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior, which include recommendations for individuals with disability for the first time, although the majority of the evidence for these guidelines was extrapolated from typically developing children. As a result, the World Health Organization has called for more research examining the applicability and benefits of the guidelines across different chronic conditions and disabilities. There's a growing body of literature to suggest that children with a medical condition or disability engage in less physical activity, obtain less sleep, and engage in more screen time compared to typically developing children. However, critical knowledge gaps currently exist. For instance, the health benefits of meeting these 24-hour movement guidelines in children with neurodevelopmental disorders is largely unknown, in addition to the impact of disability severity. Therefore, the goals of this study were to investigate 24-hour movement guideline adherence in children with neurodevelopmental disorders compared to their typically developing counterparts, to examine the influence of degree of disability severity on 24-hour movement guideline adherence in children with neurodevelopmental disorders, and to investigate the associations between guideline adherence and health outcomes in children with neurodevelopmental disorders. To our knowledge, this is the largest study to investigate movement behaviors in children with neurodevelopmental disorders. We obtained and pooled cross-sectional data from the 2018 to 2019 cycles of the National Survey of Children's Health. This survey is a nationally representative, population-based survey of children living in the U.S., and responses are provided by a parent or guardian with knowledge of the child's health. Specific questions ask about physical activity, sleep, and screen time, as well as the effect of the child's conditions on their daily activities, referred to as disability severity. You can see that children with neurodevelopmental disorders were slightly older, and there were more males compared to the sample of typically developing children. Greater than half of children with neurodevelopmental disorders reported their daily activities were never affected by their condition. At the bottom, I show the disorders grouped under the umbrella term neurodevelopmental disorder for reference. Regarding statistical analyses, we performed logistic regressions and reported adjusted odds ratios to address the study objectives. I would like to draw your attention to the top table. You can see each column represents each movement behavior guideline, while the last column is the odds of meeting an increasing number of total guidelines. Overall, you can see that children with neurodevelopmental disorders had significantly lower odds of achieving physical activity, sleep, and screen time recommendations compared to their typically developing peers. Regarding total guidelines met, children with neurodevelopmental disorders had adjusted odds ratios of 0.68, or in other words, have 32% lower odds of meeting a greater number of total guidelines compared to typically developing children. You can also notice a general trend such that as disability severity increased, the odds of guideline adherence decreased. Below, you can see the associations for 24-hour movement guidelines with anxiety, depression, and general health status. This time, the referent group was set to meeting no guidelines, and you can see that meeting at least one movement guideline was associated with significant improvements in anxiety, depression, and overall general health, while meeting two guidelines had further improvements in these health outcomes. Interestingly, was that meeting all three guidelines did not have additional improvements. To summarize, we observed a large sample of children with neurodevelopmental disorders to be significantly less likely to meet 24-hour movement guidelines compared to typically developing children. This is consistent with recent qualitative research that found parents of children with disabilities perceive the 24-hour movement guidelines to not be inclusive or compatible with their children. daily activity limitations or level of functioning should be targeted to address movement behaviors in children with neurodevelopmental disorders, and might be a factor that could have significant implications across different diagnoses. Finally, focusing on achieving at least one and striving for 2 movement guidelines is a favorable starting point to achieve health benefits in children with neurodevelopmental disorders. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation, and I look forward to answering your questions.